Wind howled through the jagged Colorado peaks the night Camilla collapsed at a rugged trapper's cabin, weeping a confession that made his blood run cold. My father sneaks in every night. Shocked to his core, this solitary mountain man prepared for violence, but the twisted truth was far more terrifying. High in the unforgiving San Juan Mountains, isolated by a brutal winter of 1883, Jedediah Boone lived a life deliberately severed from the rest of humanity. A veteran of a war that had fractured his soul, Jedediah found solace only in the absolute silence of the high timberline. His cabin, built from massive, hand-hewn ponderosa pine logs, sat perched on a precarious ridge, overlooking a valley that remained buried in snow for 6 months of the year. He was a giant of a man, hardened by frost and solitude, with a thick beard and eyes the color of a stormy sky. His days were spent checking trap lines, hunting elk, and chopping firewood, ensuring that the ghosts of his past were kept at bay by the sheer physical exhaustion of survival. He wanted nothing to do with society, and society, busy digging for silver in the boom towns below, wanted nothing to do with him. Tuesday night brought a blizzard that threatened to tear the roof from the rafters. Inside, the heavy iron stove radiated a fierce, dry heat, casting long, dancing shadows across the pelts lining the walls. Jedediah was cleaning his Winchester rifle, the repetitive mechanical action grounding him against the chaotic roar of the storm outside. Suddenly, a sound broke through the rhythmic howling of the wind. It was not the heavy, lumbering scratch of a bear, nor the sharp yip of a coyote. It was frantic, weak, and distinctly human. Setting the rifle aside, Jedediah drew his heavy Colt revolver from its holster and unbarred the thick oak door. The wind immediately blasted into the room, bringing with it a swirling vortex of white snow and a figure that fell heavily across his threshold. Cursing under his breath, Jedediah dragged the frozen mass inside and forced the door shut against the gale. Kneeling on the floorboards, he brushed away the thick crust of ice and snow to reveal a woman. She was impossibly small, dressed in a tattered, soaked calico dress that offered absolutely no protection against the freezing temperatures. Her lips were blue, her skin violently pale, and dark purple bruises mottled her jawline and neck. Jedediah immediately sprang into action. He wrapped her trembling body in his thickest bear-skin rug and pulled her close to the iron stove. He heated a tin cup of weak broth, carefully supporting her head as he coaxed the warm liquid past her chattering teeth. Slowly, painfully, the color began to return to her cheeks. When her eyes fluttered open, they were wide, frantic, and filled with a terror so profound it made Jedediah's chest ache. "You're safe," Jedediah rumbled, his voice hoarse from months of disuse. "You're high up in the timber. Nobody can track you in this storm." She shrank away from his massive frame, pulling the heavy fur tightly around her frail shoulders. Her gaze darted around the dim cabin, seeking escape, before finally settling on his rugged, weathered face. The sheer exhaustion in her eyes gave way to a sudden hysterical wave of sobbing. Her hands, scraped and bleeding from scrambling over sharp rocks, clutched at the lapels of his flannel shirt. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice cracking with despair. "He'll find me. He always finds me." "Who?" Jedediah asked, his brow furrowing. "Who did this to you, girl?" She choked on a sob, her trembling fingers tightening their grip on his shirt. Her eyes squeezed shut, releasing a flood of tears that carved clean tracks through the dirt on her face. "My father." She whispered the words, carrying a weight so heavy it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. "My father sneaks in every night." Jedediah froze. The Winchester resting on the table suddenly seemed to call out to him. The mountain man had seen the darkest depths of human cruelty on the battlefield, but the raw, visceral horror of her confession struck him like a physical blow. A cold, blinding fury ignited in his gut. He looked at the bruises on her delicate neck, the defensive scratches on her forearms, and the absolute broken defeat in her posture. I locked the door. She wept, rocking herself back and forth. I barricaded it with the heavy oak dresser. But he always finds a way. He owns the sheriff. He owns the town. He owns me. "What is your name?" Jedediah asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly calm. "Camilla," she breathed, her chin trembling. "Camilla Ortiz." Jedediah knew the name. Everyone within 100 miles knew the name. Josiah Ortiz was a ruthless cattle baron who controlled the sprawling valleys below. He was a man of immense wealth, political influence, and notorious cruelty. If Josiah Ortiz was her father, Camilla was running from a man who commanded a small army of hired guns. "Rest now, Camilla." Jedediah said, his large, calloused hand gently brushing a damp lock of hair from her bruised forehead. The tenderness in his own gesture surprised him. It had been years since he had touched another human being with anything other than intent to harm. "He won't sneak in here. I swear it on my life." As Camilla succumbed to the heavy, dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted Jedediah, Boone didn't sleep. He spent the remainder of the night sitting in the heavy wooden chair facing the door, his Winchester resting across his lap, his jaw set like granite. The solitary mountain man had spent a decade running from war, only to find that the most righteous battle of his life had just crawled through his front door. Morning broke with a blinding, crystalline clarity. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a pristine, untouched world of glittering white snow. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Camilla awoke with a start, instinctively scrambling backward until her spine hit the log wall. It took several agonizing seconds for her to process her surroundings. The rough-hewn timber, the smell of wood smoke and roasting coffee, and the giant man standing by the stove, flipping a thick cut of venison in a cast-iron skillet. Jedediah didn't look at her, giving her the space she desperately needed to orient herself. "Eat," he said gruffly, sliding the meat and a hard biscuit onto a tin plate and setting it on the small wooden table. "You've lost too much strength. The cold up here will kill a weak body." Camilla approached the table cautiously, wrapping the bearskin tightly around herself, like armor. She ate ravenously, her manners abandoned, in the face of sheer starvation. Jedediah watched her from the corner of his eye, his heart aching at the sight of her ravenous hunger. Despite the dirt, the bruises, and the wild, unkempt tangle of her hair, there was an undeniable tragic beauty to her. "Josiah Ortiz," Jedediah said abruptly, pouring himself a cup of black coffee. "He's your father." Camilla flinched at the name, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. She lowered her gaze to her plate, her shoulders slumping. "Not by blood," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the crackling fire. Jedediah raised an eyebrow, waiting silently. "My real parents died of cholera when I was 12. Camilla explained, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of the fur rug. "Josiah was an associate of my father's. He offered to take me in. To the outside world, he played the generous benefactor, the grieving friend adopting an orphaned child." A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. "I thought I was saved. He gave me a beautiful room in his mansion, fine clothes, tutors. But as I grew older," she trailed off, swallowing hard. The memory clearly suffocated her. "He didn't adopt a daughter," Jedediah finished for her, his voice low and laced with disgust. "He groomed a prisoner." Camilla nodded, a fresh tear escaping her eye. "When I turned 18 last month, the pretense ended. The locks on my door were changed to lock from the outside. That's when the night visits began. I realized he wasn't going to marry me off to secure a political alliance like he claimed. I was his property, his secret. She looked up at Jedediah, her gaze piercing. I couldn't take it anymore. Last night I stole a horse and rode blindly into the storm. I knew the snow would hide my tracks, but I also knew I would probably freeze to death. I decided the ice was a better lover than Josiah. Jedediah set his coffee cup down with a heavy thud. The sheer bravery of this fragile woman astounded him. She had chosen the deadly embrace of a mountain blizzard over a life of captive torment. A profound, fierce instinct to protect her surged through his veins, an emotion he hadn't felt since he held his dying brother on the battlefield of Antietam. "You didn't freeze," Jedediah said softly. "You found me." Before Camilla could respond, a sharp, echoing crack snapped through the crisp mountain air. Jedediah moved with terrifying speed. In a fraction of a second, he kicked the chair away, grabbed his rifle and flattened himself against the wall beside the frosted window. Camilla gasped, dropping her fork, her eyes wide with renewed terror. "Stay away from the glass," Jedediah hissed, peering through a small thawed patch on the window pane. Down in the valley about a half-mile away, the pristine snow was marred by a dark, moving line. Riders, at least half a dozen of them, pushing their exhausted horses through chest-deep drifts. They were following the tree line, systematically working their way up the ridge. Leading the pack was a man wearing a heavy buffalo coat, flanked by two large, vicious-looking tracking hounds. The storm must have broken earlier down below. Jedediah muttered, his jaw clenched tight. "They didn't track your horse. They used the dogs to track your scent before the snow covered it completely." Camilla crawled toward him, her face chalk white. "Is it him?" "He's wearing a buffalo coat," Jedediah confirmed. Camilla let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. "He'll kill you. Josiah pays the worst men in the territory to do his bidding. Mercenaries. Killers. Please just give me to him. I can't let you die for me." Jedediah turned to her, his massive frame towering over her huddled form. He knelt, placing two large, rough hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look into his stormy eyes. There was no fear in his gaze, only a cold, calculated readiness. "I spent 4 years fighting a war to free people who were kept in chains." Jedediah said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. "I didn't lose my soul in that bloodbath, just to hand a woman back to her monster. Josiah Ortiz doesn't own this mountain. I do." He stood up, shedding his heavy indoor flannel and strapping on a thick leather bandolier laden with heavy brass cartridges. He grabbed a second revolver, a short-barreled Colt Peacemaker, and shoved it into the waistband of his trousers. "There's a root cellar under the floorboards by the bed." Jedediah instructed, his tone suddenly shifting to that of a commanding officer. "Lift the rug. Climb down. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear up here. If I don't come back down to get you, there are snowshoes and a map to a mining camp 3 days west. You take them and you run." "Jedediah, no," Camilla protested, grabbing his arm. The physical contact sent a jolt through both of them, a sudden spark of profound connection amidst the impending violence. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "They are too many." "They are flatlanders," Jedediah replied grimly, cocking the lever of his Winchester. The metallic clack was loud and definitive. "They don't know the timberline. They don't know the ice." He threw open the heavy oak door, stepping out into the blinding white glare of the morning sun. The frigid air hit him like a physical blow, but the adrenaline rushing through his veins burned hotter than a forge. He moved swiftly, melting into the dense stand of snow-laden pines that flanked the trail leading to his cabin. Down below, The hounds suddenly erupted into a frenzy of baying. They had caught the scent. Josiah Ortiz pulled his black stallion to a halt, raising a gloved hand to signal his men. Even from a distance, Jedediah could see the arrogance in the man's posture. Josiah shouted something to his men, pointing his riding crop toward the thin wisp of smoke rising from Jedediah's chimney. "Spread out," a voice carried up the ridge, sharp and commanding. "Surround the perimeter. The bitch is in that cabin." Jedediah steadied his breathing, resting the barrel of his rifle against the rough bark of a pine tree. He sighted down the iron notch, settling the front bead squarely on the chest of a mercenary, attempting to flank the left side of the ridge. He wasn't going to wait for them to knock. This was his mountain, and the trespassers had just declared war. He slowly squeezed the trigger. Gunfire shattered the pristine morning silence, the sharp crack of Jedediah's Winchester echoing like thunder across the icy peaks. Below the ridge, the lead mercenary crumpled into a deep snowdrift, clutching his shattered collarbone. Panic immediately seized the remaining riders. Horses reared, screaming in terror as their hooves floundered in the chest-deep powder. Men cursed, diving from their saddles to seek cover behind the thick trunks of the ponderosa pines. Josiah Ortiz's face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. "Return fire! You coward shootback! Bring me the girl!" Bullets began to tear through the forest canopy. Pine cones and splintered bark rained down around Jedediah, but the mountain man had already vanished from his initial firing position. Slipping silently through a hidden trench he had dug for drainage weeks ago, he relocated 30 yards to the east. Taking a slow, controlled breath, Jedediah lined up his sights again. Another squeeze of the trigger, another deafening blast, and a second hired gun dropped his pistol, howling, as a .44 caliber slug tore through his thigh. Crimson sprayed across the untouched snow, a stark contrast to the white landscape. Fear began to paralyze the attackers. Fighting a man on equal ground was one thing, but fighting an unseen ghost in a frozen hellscape was entirely different. The mercenaries were hardened killers, men who had gunned down farmers and rustlers in the dusty plains, but up here in the thin air and sub-zero temperatures, they were out of their depth. "Release the hounds!" Josiah roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "Let the dogs tear his throat out. I want him ripped to pieces." Two massive scarred mastiffs lunged forward, their thick chains slipping from their handlers' grasp. Saliva froze to their jowls as they bounded up the slope, driven mad by the scent of gunpowder and combat. Their large paws acted like snowshoes, allowing them to glide over the drifts that bogged down the horses. Jedediah hated killing animals, knowing they were only instruments of their cruel master. Drawing his Colt Peacemaker, he fired 2 warning shots into the snow directly in front of the charging dogs. Ice and dirt exploded into their faces. Startled by the concussive blasts and the stinging debris, the hounds tucked their tails and broke off the charge, fleeing back toward the valley floor, yelping in confusion. Furious, Josiah unholstered his own silver-plated revolver, firing blindly into the trees. "Burn him out! Set the timber ablaze if you have to. I want that cabin reduced to ash, and I want him roasted alive." Flames were impossible to sustain in the damp, frozen timber, but the mercenaries began creeping closer, laying down a suppressing barrage of lead that pinned Jedediah behind a massive granite boulder. Chips of rock flew into the air, slicing across Jedediah's cheek. He ignored the stinging pain, rapidly reloading his rifle. Meanwhile, inside the dim confines of the root cellar, Camilla listened to the terrifying symphony of violence above. Dust-dried dirt and small pebbles sifted through the floorboards onto her hair with every bullet that slammed into the cabin's sturdy log walls. The smell of burning powder drifted down through the cracks, choking her. Terror threatened to pull her under, back into the helpless state of mind she had occupied for years. She remembered the heavy thud of Josiah's boots in the hallway, the sinister click of the lock, the suffocating scent of his cigars. But as she huddled in the dark, freezing cellar, a new, unfamiliar emotion suddenly sparked in her chest. Anger. Righteous, burning anger. For years she had cowered in the shadows of Josiah's mansion, waiting for someone to rescue her. Now a stranger was bleeding in the snow, risking everything to protect a woman he didn't even know. Jedediah was fighting a war that belonged to her. Crawling toward the small set of wooden stairs, Camilla pushed against the trap door. It creaked open. The cabin above was filled with grey wood smoke and the bitter stench of sulphur. The cold wind howled through bullet holes in the front windows. Scanning the room, her eyes landed on Jedediah's heavy double-barreled shotgun resting near the stone fireplace. He had loaded it the night before, but left it behind in his rush to intercept the riders. Grabbing the heavy weapon, Camilla checked the breeches. 2 brass shells gleamed in the dim light. She wasn't entirely sure how to handle the massive gun, having only ever fired a tiny pocket pistol, but survival instinct guided her trembling hands. The iron was freezing to the touch, grounding her in reality. Creeping toward the frost-covered window, she peered outside. Through the drifting smoke, she spotted a mercenary sneaking along the side of the cabin, a lit torch in his hand, preparing to throw it onto the dry pine needles packed near the roof. He was grinning, confident that the mountain man was pinned down elsewhere. Lifting the heavy shotgun, Camilla rested the barrels on the window ledge. The weapon was incredibly heavy, forcing her to brace her shoulder against the log wall. She took a deep breath, aimed directly at the center of the glass, and pulled both triggers simultaneously. Deafening explosion shattered the entire window pane, sending a lethal shower of buckshot and jagged glass outward. The recoil slammed into Camilla's shoulder like a mule kick, throwing her backward onto the floorboards. Outside, the mercenary screamed, dropping the torch into the snow as he was blown backward off his feet, his chest peppered with lead. Shock rippled through the remaining attackers. They thought the girl was a helpless captive, a frightened doe hiding in the woods. They had not anticipated facing armed resistance from inside the structure. Jedediah used the distraction perfectly. Breaking from his cover behind the granite boulder, he charged forward with terrifying speed. He didn't fire wildly. His movements were precise, calculated, and deadly. He closed the distance on a mercenary, hiding behind a deadfall, vaulting over the rotting logs, and striking the man across the jaw with the heavy brass butt plate of his Winchester. The man collapsed instantly. "To hell with this pay!" Another hired gun screamed, scrambling toward his horse. "The old man is crazy, and that mountain man is a demon." Within seconds, the remaining mercenaries abandoned the assault. Survival outweighed gold. They frantically spurred their exhausted horses back down the treacherous mountain trail, sliding and stumbling through the snow, leaving their ruthless employer behind. Silence descended heavily upon the ridge, broken only by the whistling wind, the distant snapping of branches, and the ragged breathing of the exhausted mountain man. The battle had been won, but the war was not over. Only one figure remained standing in the trampled, snow-covered yard. Josiah Ortiz. Madness glinted in the cattle baron's eyes. His expensive buffalo coat was torn, his silk cravat was askew, his hat was gone, and his face was purple from the freezing cold. Seeing his men flee, Josiah realized he had lost his private army, but his toxic obsession with Camilla blinded him to all reason. He was a man used to owning everything he surveyed. He could not fathom losing his most prized possession. Raising his silver-plated revolver, Josiah aimed squarely at Jedediah's back as the mountain man turned toward the cabin. "You die today, mountain trash!" Josiah spat, pulling the hammer back. Before Josiah could pull the trigger, the heavy oak door of the cabin kicked open violently. Camilla stood on the threshold. She had dropped the empty shotgun and was now holding a small pearl-handled derringer, the very weapon she had stolen from Josiah's desk the night she finally ran away. "Drop it, Josiah," Camilla ordered, her voice cutting through the frigid air like a razor. It did not shake. Josiah slowly turned to face her, a twisted, mocking smile spreading across his face. "Camilla, my sweet, foolish girl, put that little toy away before you hurt yourself. You belong to me. You will always belong to me. Come here right now. I belong to no one." She whispered, her hands remarkably steady as she leveled the barrel at his chest. Jedediah watched frozen for a fraction of a second, realizing the profound weight of this confrontation. He could easily draw his peacemaker and end the Baron's life, but he recognized the fire in Camilla's eyes. This wasn't his battle to finish. This was the moment she reclaimed her soul. "You won't shoot me," Josiah sneered, taking a confident step toward the porch. "You don't have the stomach for it. I raised you. I clothed you. You're just a weak, frightened little bird who forgot her cage." Josiah raised his gun, pivoting it back toward Jedediah to eliminate the mountain man once and for all, intending to deal with Camilla afterward. Camilla did the unthinkable. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate or close her eyes. She stared directly into the eyes of the monster who had stolen her youth. Squeezing the tiny trigger, the derringer cracked sharply. Josiah stopped dead in his tracks. The mocking smile vanished, replaced by a mask of absolute, uncomprehending shock. A blossoming stain of crimson ruined the front of his pristine white shirt, spreading rapidly across the expensive silk. He looked down at his chest, then back up at the fragile girl he had tormented for years. The silver revolver slipped from his numb, trembling fingers, landing softly in the snow. Collapsing to his knees, Josiah Ortiz let out a wet, rattling gasp. He tried to speak, but only air passed his lips. He fell face first into the freezing powder, dead before his body settled into the snowdrift. Dropping the smoking derringer, Camilla sank to her knees on the wooden porch. Her entire body began shaking violently as the adrenaline finally left her system, replaced by the sheer, overwhelming reality of what she had just done. Jedediah immediately rushed to her side. He holstered his weapons and gathered her into his massive, warm arms, pulling her tightly against his chest, shielding her from the biting wind and the gruesome sight in the yard. "It's over," Jedediah murmured into her hair, his rough voice cracking with raw emotion. "He can never touch you again. The nightmare is dead in the snow." Camilla buried her face in his canvas coat, her tears soaking into the fabric. This time, however, they were not tears of terror or despair, but tears of absolute, profound relief. The chains of her past lay broken, shattered by her own hand. Weeks turned into months, and the harsh, unforgiving winter slowly surrendered to the vibrant, colorful bloom of a Colorado spring. Wildflowers carpeted the high meadows in bursts of violet and gold. Down in the valley, the sprawling empire of Josiah Ortiz crumbled into dust, consumed by greedy politicians and rival ranchers fighting over the scraps. Nobody ever came looking for him in the high timber, assuming the arrogant baron had been swallowed by an avalanche or a treacherous ravine. High up on the secluded ridge, life flourished. The solitary mountain man had found something worth living for, realizing that a life without connection was merely survival, not living. And the captive bird had finally found a sky vast enough to fly safe in the arms of a man who viewed her as an equal and property. Jedediah and Camilla built a beautiful life together, forged in the fires of survival, and bound by an unbreakable, unspoken vow of protection, respect and deep, enduring love. In the heart of the wild mountains, they finally found the truest freedom of all. Did this Wild West tale of survival and redemption keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved Camilla's bravery and the mountain man's fierce protection, please hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical dramas, romance, and epic frontier adventures. Leave a comment below with your favorite plot twist.